Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we are delighted to have two authors with us today. Our friend Sarah Stewart Taylor, her brand new book is called Hunter's Heart Ridge, and as always, Sarah very kindly signed a batch of books for us. I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to order one of the autographed copies. And then Archer Sullivan, whose brand new book is The Witch's Orchard. And she has also signed some books for us. So I'll put links to both of them in the comments field. And if you have questions for either author, go ahead and type them in. And I'll be brought back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I would be happy to ask any of your questions. So, Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's lovely to see you again, Sarah. Whoop, wrong book. This is the sequel to Agony Hill, a book that we really loved last year. It was a historical fiction pick for probably August, because August seems to be your month. Archers is a debut mystery, and it's our first mystery club book for August. And as I have written up, it reminds me of Julia Kelly's wonderful series set in West Virginia, which I was sad that she discontinued, but also the best of Sharon McCrum before she took a turn in some direction. And there are other authors who write well of the South, but I thought the general ethos, particularly of Julia, was very good here. But I just we just did an event for Megan Miranda and JT Ellison last week, Archer, and there were there were things in those books that I thought, because one's a small Virginia town and one is a small Tennessee town. There were some
Mm.
issues there about women that I thought pertained to you, and even more so, I think tomorrow night for our book launch for Lisa Gardner, Frankie Elkins is a person who is a um, without any formal training and without any actual authority. This will be her fourth mission going to look for missing persons. And somehow or other, she manages to get people to cooperate and talk to her and try to find these people. So I felt like your Annie Gore was a bit like Frankie. Are you familiar with this series that I'm mentioning, or is that a surprise to you?
No, yeah, it's a surprise to me.
Ah, well, the good news for you is Lisa's a massive number one bestseller. So it's not a bad thing if I say that I think that Annie Gore reminds me of Frankie Elkins, but she does. So you might want to look up a book called Kiss Me Goodbye
I
uh,
will.
when we're done with this conversation, and you'll sort of see what I mean. And interestingly enough, Sarah, we had a long conversation with Michael Carita yesterday, writing as Scott Carson in his book set in Maine, nearby Vermont. Is about the 1960s,
Mhm.
with an AI component that sort of crosses up to today. But again, about the Cold War, paranoia, and so forth. And I find it really interesting because, I was out of college and a mom and, working in the 1960s. And so you're all treating it as history. And I'm going, hmm. Great. So, but I thought you did very well, even though I'm not familiar with Vermont. I thought that the general ethos of your book was extremely well done. So they've talked to each other, which is a really nice thing. So I don't have to talk to them the entire time. But let me ask Sarah to tell us about why she started writing Agony Hill, which was something different for her, and how that led to. I keep holding the books the wrong way. Why am I doing that? To Hunter's Heart Ridge. So, Sarah.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having us, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Barbara. And Poison Pen is the gold standard, so it's so great to get to do these events when my books come out. And congratulations, Archer! It's fun to get to do this the night before launch, so it's very exciting. So yeah, Agony Hill was a bit of a departure for me in that it's set in the 1960s. And my interest in the period really came out of, uh, you know, I live in Vermont and I didn't grow up here, but my father grew up right on the border in New Hampshire. And I have a lot of family and friends in the area. And I've just heard so many stories about things that happened in the 1960s that have sort of determined a lot of the conditions here in our state today. One of the big ones was the construction of the interstate highway system. And Vermont until the early 1960s, when Interstates 91 and 89 arrived, it was very difficult to get anywhere. You had to drive on slow little roads, and it took hours and hours to get to Boston or New York. And the interstates were, for some people, promising. They opened up opportunity. For other people, the coming of the interstates was very scary. And there was all this angst about what kinds of elements it would bring and, how it would change our little state. And so I was just fascinated by that period. And that's really where Agony Hill started. And then as I started to research all of the other things going on in the state and of course nationally, it felt like a great sort of stew of tensions and dynamics that I could play with in a small town mystery.
Well, you certainly can. Of course, the interstate introduced, since Vermont's a border state, introduced, you know, drug trafficking, all
Mhm.
kinds of things. I am familiar with Vermont largely by reading the entire work of Archer Mayer,
Yes,
who
another
I'm
Archer.
devoted to, and every one of his books, I've talked to him. He's been here, and my husband's cousin lives in Vermont.
Oh,
So, while I have only spent a small amount of time there, I feel that's the great thing about books, is that Archer, if you read Archer, there's not a corner of Vermont that he hasn't written about.
yes.
And his characters are great, but he also really understood. I have to write to him and find out why he's not writing anymore. He may have just aged out. Um, but the way he could bring Vermont as a character to the front of the books. For me, Vermont was always really the main character, and Joe Gunther and all the other people, were sort of in service to exploring Vermont, which I
Yes. And I think too, he writes about Vermont beyond the tourist traps.
oh yeah,
He really captures the state and in all of its sort of complexity and the gritty stuff as well as the beautiful stuff. And I've always appreciated that so much. And I use him as a model in terms of how to write about a place with love but honesty as well.
yeah. Well, you really could not. I mean, Brattleboro, and the old Ready Mill buildings, and it's not all glamour in Middlebury College and that kind of thing. But the 1960s is an interesting time because there's the Cold War paranoia, but we're also, as you say, with the interstate, we're beginning to move a little bit more towards modern. Although, my favorite hair mousse comes from a Vermont goat milk company,
Oh, wonderful.
which
I
I
love that.
found, believe it or not, found on a cruise ship, where they carried trying to remember what it's called. Is it Beach Keep? Something, I'll have to look it up. But
Oh,
it's like the best ever. But what I love is the fact that they make soap and shampoo and
yeah.
hairspray, or mousse rather, and it's all from Vermont goat milk. And
Goat
I
milk. I
think
love it.
that there are these sort of like cottage industries in Vermont, some of which are still rooted in the rural, aren't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you've ever used Bag Balm, if you know what Bag Balm is, it's one of our most famous exports from Vermont. And it's a wonderful hand cream that we have a farm, and so my hands are often very dry, but it's a wonderful hand moisturizer that originally was used on cows' bags or udders. And
Okay,
it's
right.
now a famous Vermont export. People, it has an Instagram account.
Does it really? Well, I'll have to keep that in mind. So while we're talking about place, let's talk to Archer. Tell us about you're in the shadow of the Blue Ridge. Interestingly enough, I lived in Oak Ridge and in Bristol, Virginia for years. And so I have spent much of my life in the Blue Ridge Mountains, at least driving through them,
Mhm.
the Great Smokies and all the rest of it. So what part are you talking about here?
Well, Annie is from Southern Kentucky, but she goes to a town called Quartz Creek, which is a fictional small town in Western North Carolina. And that is where the 95% of the book takes place.
Sure. Sort of near Asheville?
Yeah. My mom's family is from Western North Carolina, going way back. And I spent a lot of time there as a kid. I lived in Swananoa, Black Mountain, Asheville. And that's really what I'm picturing when I'm writing.
I thought you were. I'm in, before the floods,
Yeah.
because, or the hurricane really did a number on Asheville, which is not only a college town, but really very sophisticated, a great literary history. All kinds of
Mhm.
iconic poets and authors and other stuff live there. Poison Pen Press published a long series set in Asheville. So we
Uh,
got to tour some of the literary and other artistic icons of North Carolina. So what interested you? You've pulled Annie away from where she is to go to this town. Why did you do that?
I think I wanted to pull her out of her element. And also, it is really reflective of my own experience. I grew up in Appalachia, but sort of all over Appalachia. My dad was from Kentucky and my mom was from North Carolina, and they split up when I was a kid. And they're both very bohemian people. So I ended up moving around within Appalachia a lot. I went to 13 different schools before high school. And that doesn't even count the number of times I went back to the same school a few times,
Yeah.
like within a couple of years. So my experience was not in one place. It was always showing up as the new kid and being a stranger and being sort of not necessarily welcomed. And I think that when it came to writing Annie's story, I just sort of made her experience the same thing that I always had. It's showing up in a town where nobody knows you and just doing your best there.
Hmm.
Wow, that's so different than at least one of your characters, isn't it, Sarah?
Right. Well, I mean, I have two characters in the book, and you're right. One of them is very much of the town of Bethany. Alice Bellows grew up there. She's gone away and had a very exciting life all over the world with her CIA agent husband, but it's her hometown and she knows everything about it. She knows, where all the bodies are buried. She knows who's related to whom, and she's now living back in the town, and she gets to know a newcomer who, in many ways, is more like Annie. Franklin Warren, my other character, is a Boston cop who moves to this small town in Vermont to take a job with the Vermont State Police, and he brings that outsider's I think like Annie, I think when you're an outsider, you sometimes see things that other people don't see. You pick up on patterns and you notice behaviors that have become normal to the people in the town. And so Franklin and Alice, I like to think kind of balance each other out. He's the outsider, she's the insider, and they each have something to offer the other.
Right. So what is Annie's background? Because, you need to have some sort of skill set if you're going to decide to, step in here and solve a mystery. Well, I mean, there are, the cozy ground where you could be a cat sitter or bicycle shop repairman or, maintenance or whatever. And I'm not making fun of that.
Yeah.
But to really bring off solving a crime, eventually you do have to have an actual law enforcement person, who has the power of arrest. So Annie doesn't have that, but what is her professional background?
So she's a PI professionally, but her background is she entered the Air Force as soon as she graduated high school, and she started out in security forces, but then became a special investigator. So she was basically a cop within the Air Force.
Sort of like Jack Reacher, actually, just like Jack Reacher.
Military.
Yeah, except he was in the army, right? I
Yep.
think a different branch.
No, you're
But
right. No, he was in the Army, Major Reacher, but and definitely was a military investigator.
yes, yeah, exactly. And like an MP. So yeah, that's her background. And when she got out, she decided she wanted to keep doing that, but she didn't want a boss anymore. She wanted to be her own boss. So she opened her own private investigation business.
And how's that going?
It's going okay. She can sort of pay her bills most of the time.
Okay, but what
But
draws her
in the,
then?
I'm sorry.
What draws her to take this case in another place?
So in this book, the guy who approaches her is a young man. He's only 18. He's just graduated high school, and he's very sympathetic in that he's been missing his sister for 10 years, and he saved up all this time for a good private investigator, one that would understand his hometown and not look down on the people there. And so he reaches out to Annie, and Annie agrees to take the case, even though she's pretty sure she's probably not going to find anything,
Okay,
which
so
it is a book. So, she will actually find some things.
well, no, I mean, one assumes that when we starts off on the journey, but I was just kind of thought that you might want to explain why it is that, she obviously didn't have a lot of pressing work where she was, or she
Yes,
could
that's true. Yeah,
motored off.
yeah, she is struggling to pay her bills, and she has just had to put her watch in hock. She's had to pawn her watch, not for the
Okay.
first time. So she really needs to get it out. It was her uncle's or her uncle's service watch. So she needs to get it back. So she agrees to take this case.
Right, so she really does need the money,
Mhm.
in addition to taking the work. So each of you does a really good job in these books, I think, by hiding what's going on in plain sight. So we'll come back to you. But Sarah, are there actually like hunt clubs or whatever? I mean, there certainly are in other places I've lived. CJ Box lives very adjacent to a truly amazing one in Wyoming. And I've been to visit him, and you could watch like the private planes fly in and these people, driving up the road and over the mountain and whatever. And that's very much of today. But in the 60s, I remember my dad, who was in the telephone industry, used to be invited. Alcoa used to have hunting and fishing retreats. They owned like, rural property, and they would invite business executives, to go off for a week with. So I mean, he had a beautiful rifle and he had a fabulous fishing rod and the whole 9 yards. Is that what's going on in your town?
It is to a certain extent. So Vermont, it's kind of interesting. Vermont actually has a very strong history of family hunting camps. So, a family would own a very modest kind of rustic cabin especially in the northern part of the state, but around the state. And the men in the family and some of the women would go for deer season and be at camp for the 2 weeks of deer season. There are some elite hunting clubs, though, in Vermont. And in fact, there's a men's fishing club very close to where I live that, in many ways, is sort of the model for the one in the book. It's, the rumor is that some huge number of US presidents have visited this place, kind of, off the radar.
Right.
And it's had very prominent people as members. It's also the club in my book is also partly based on an exotic game club in New Hampshire, which is the most incredible place. I could talk to you about it for like an hour or two, but if you're interested, you can Google Corbin Park in New Hampshire. And it's a really fascinating place, very secretive, and the people who live around it only found out or only got a good sense of what was going on because some wild boar escaped from the park and took up residence on people's properties around. And so it's kind of a fascinating place. But yeah, it was fun to create kind of a mashup of some different fishing and hunting clubs and populate it with very powerful men who are in various ways involved in the war in Vietnam, and their sons who are against the war, and kind of put all of these people together in a hunting lodge and add a snowstorm and a power outage and see what happens.
Yes, is that classic Agatha Christie country house design that you created there. And when you put people with money and power and secrecy. It makes it a really tough job to investigate. So the obstacles facing. So who gets killed?
So the first victim is a former ambassador to West Germany who has left Europe sort of disgraced. He's had some problems, and as Warren starts to look into his life, he'll discover that, things are not quite as they seem with his career. But he's the first death, and then while Warren is investigating his shooting, the snowstorm comes in, and Warren and his deputy Pinky are stranded at the club. And then there's another death, and this one is really strange, and Warren has to solve it before dawn to
Ooh, a ticking clock on top.
exactly to save the lives of the rest of the
Great.
people at the club. So.
Great. Well, Archer, tell us about the community. We've mentioned where it is, but are we looking at different economic classes in this little community in the
Yeah.
Western Carolina mountains?
Yeah. It's in Quartz Creek, there was a toy factory and it operated there for quite some time. And then 10 years ago, it shut down. And it was the economic backbone of that town. So when it left, the unemployment rate there skyrocketed. And like in a lot of other parts of Appalachia and rural areas in general, there's been a lot of flight of younger generations moving out for better jobs, better college, better internet. And so Quartz Creek is very small and it is pretty run down at this point. So when Annie gets there, there are a lot of boarded up buildings in downtown Quartz Creek, and people are really struggling. And they're struggling financially, but they're also struggling with the kidnappings of the two little girls from 10 years before.
So was it more or less a company town?
It was, I think, more or less a company town. One of the towns that I lived in, Swannanoa, was more or less a company town. It wasn't a company town in the way that the coal towns of Eastern Kentucky, but Swannanoa had the Beacon Blanket Mill, which owned a lot of the businesses there that people would go to, and it employed the people in those businesses, and it employed the people who worked in the blanket mill, and eventually it went under. And I mean, it's always hard on those communities. The towns that I grew up in Kentucky were completely dependent on those factories, and when they shut down, it's hard for even the fast food restaurants to stay open.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like what happened with COVID decimating, Midtown Manhattan on a much bigger scale. But Steve Berry wrote a book about a company town in Georgia, a paper mill town that he and I talked about a couple of weeks ago. And so it's kind of on my mind about the devastation that the closing of, and, while I appreciate our president's idea of bringing some of that back, the truth is it probably can't happen. And so you have to find other industries or other means of employment for people, but you do wind up, as you say, with flight. And I wonder how long, during COVID, urban people flew flew to, rural and, remote areas and all for safety. But now I'm wondering to what degree that's reversing. It certainly made a giant difference in Scottsdale. We got way too many people. And they're not leaving, although maybe more days of 117 will help. But, it did allow people to work at home and to create maybe other sorts of jobs, but that's not what you're finding. So in your community, even though it's decimated, there is certainly at least one, if not more, people who managed to hang on to the wealth that even though the company closed. So do you have a kind of animosity in the town between the haves and the have-nots?
A little bit. I think the person in town who, at least in this story, has managed to hang on to their wealth Dina Drake, there is some animosity in the town toward her because her husband was the person who owned the factory,
Right.
and she's the one who sold it when he died. So there is some animosity toward her, but she stays up in her castle most of the time in a very nice house on top of the mountain. And that is certainly something that I encountered a lot as a kid. My mom cleaned houses like that, and we would see them. And I remember being inside them thinking, this is ridiculous. This is crazy. It's so nice. And I think that disparity is even more pronounced in places like that. I think cities, it's definitely, you can see it, it's there. But I think in rural areas, you can really see the difference in land architecture and the space that people take up.
Well, yeah, there's a huge second home thing or retirement home thing in North Carolina due to its favorable tax laws. So, I hardly even recognize on the occasions that I've been back to Southwest Virginia and that area. I can hardly believe, the size of the homes and the lakes that have been gentrified and the, $100,000 initiation fee for the country clubs and the whole bit. It's just so different. And, in my life, it's only been like 40 years since I left. So I find it fascinating. Anyway, you have both read each other's books. So why don't I stop asking you questions and you ask each other questions? Sarah, why don't you talk to Archer and then we'll reverse it?
Sure. Well, I loved the book Archer. It's so full of atmosphere, and you do such an incredible job of describing this place. I just immediately felt like I was there, and the smells and the just you really do a great job of it. Um, I'm curious about how you achieved that. Was it just so much in your head that you were able to just, get those details as you were writing, or did you find you had to kind of go back and do some research and kind of capture specific sounds and sights?
Well, that is a really good question.
Yeah, it is.
Um, I so I a few years ago, because I've always had a real tendency towards strong sensory detail in my work. It comes through all the time, no matter what I'm writing. And I notice things like that a lot.
Mhm.
And this is sort of related to a character in your book to an extent, in Agony Hill especially. But a couple of years ago, we realized, oh, I might be neurodivergent. And so actually, after I turned 40, I was diagnosed with autism. And we found out that, oh, this is why my senses are turned up so high,
Yeah.
because I smell things and it just sticks with me, and I smell them really strongly.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with like lights and noises and tastes. It's everything is turned up really high all the time. And so those memories just stick in my head. So, writing about like the smell of a fall morning in the mountains is something that I didn't really need to do a lot with. The
Yeah.
biggest thing with research was I said, I emailed my mom and I said, let me know when these flowers bloom. Let me know when you start
Yeah.
to see these plants coming out, because she still lives in Western North Carolina. She lives in Swannanoa. And I said, let me know when it starts to smell like this, because I want to make sure that, are there still any mosquitoes going on right now? Because those are the things that, when I'm writing, I am like 95% of me is in the scene.
Yeah.
And so when I write, it just sort of happens. Those things that I've experienced just sort of come back out.
Yeah.
So.
But you're right. It's so important when you're writing about a rural place and about the natural world that you get the timing of things correct. And
Yes.
I'll tell you a funny story with my very first book, Oh Artful Death. I had a scene where someone was describing a field of wildflowers. And, I really had fun with the names of the wildflowers and, she looked and saw the da and the da 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 da. And this woman wrote me like a 3-page letter, saying, you said that these wildflowers were blooming at the same time, and that would not happen. This one blooms a week later, and she was really, really upset. So you're right to try to pin those details down. People
Yeah,
care.
in the country, the flora and fauna is as the movement of that is as solid as the calendar.
Absolutely.
And you
Yeah.
see it every single day. I mean, you live on a farm, so you see it every single day. It's as concrete as anything.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, probably more concrete than a calendar or a clock because those things are sort of made up. But anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Well, it's fun to hear that's the way you perceive the world because it comes through so strongly in your book. It's just wonderful.
Oh, sure. What would you like to ask Sarah?
I would like to ask because this is one of my favorite things about both Agony Hill and Hunter's Heart's Ridge. It's you could have a very good mystery with just Franklin and Pinky. You could totally have just a really solid, well-written, beautiful literary mystery that holds together perfectly. But you also have Alice. And Alice is such a great addition to this book and to both books. To this, like when I think of these books in my head, I think of Franklin and Alice. And like they're a team, even though they're not exactly working together. So my question is, where did Alice come from? How did when you began conceiving of this, did you plan for her or did she come out of the blue?
So this series actually started with Alice. Alice was the first person I had in this world. And she's based on a lot of women I know. I live in a small town where there have been I've known sort of 2 or 3 iterations, I think, of this woman, but I think they go very far back, many generations of, women who, if they had been born 40 years later, they would be running companies. They would
Yeah.
be, they would have been in charge of everything. And their options were limited because of when they were born. And so instead, they keep their towns running. And they are the women who sit on the library board and contribute to the cultural life of the town. They're the women who, when a family has fallen on hard times, make sure that everybody prepares meals and drops them off. They are the women who know what's going on and can kind of step in and provide help. And I think especially in the 60s and before, they really, these women were kind of keeping these towns going. And so I wanted Alice to be kind of at the center of the novel. And I wanted her to also have this very sort of interesting life and this set of skills as an intelligence gatherer that she could contribute to Warren's work and to his understanding of the town.
Yeah, I can't wait to see where her story goes. I love Alice and I love the combination of Franklin and Alice.
But we also have a third person involved, another woman involved.
Yes.
And I wondered if we would see her again in the second book because she was a pivotal character in Agony Hill. I will say, I don't say this all that often, but I really do think you have to read Agony Hill before you read Hunter's Heart Ridge. Otherwise, there are going to be bunches of spoilers and it will never be the same to go back to it. That's only 2 books, so it's not that hard.
You can do it. And it's in paperback. Agony Hill's in paperback now. So
it is, right. But I do think that that's an interesting, addition. So you've actually got 3 characters that we are following, so far. Now, whether one of them will drop out or not, I can't say because you haven't written the third book. Well, I haven't seen the third book, but that's pretty complicated. Could you have written something like that when you started?
So, that's a good question. If I could have written something like that when I started, I don't know actually, but Sylvie was one of those characters who started out just as she was functional. The victim in the first book had to have a wife, and of course Warren was going to interview her, and you know, I, I don't know that I thought she would have that much of a story. But as I started to write about her and I started to see the way that she perceives the world and the way that her poetry, sort in some ways acts as her way of communicating with people when she maybe has trouble communicating in other ways, I just kind of fell in love with her and I just wanted to know her and I wanted to write more about her and to really give her a storyline. And so that's really where Sylvie came from. And now I have an arc imagined for her and she'll be pretty important, I hope to the series. Um, but yeah, she was just one of those wonderful surprises that you sometimes get when you're writing. Um,
Right. But you're staying in the same community. So, Archer, what is it that you imagine Annie is going to do? This case, um,
Hmm.
it does conclude, because let's be, it's a mystery, and generally there has to be like a solution to the whole thing. What is it you see going to happen?
Well, as much as I love Quartz Creek and the people there, Annie has to go back to her regular life in Louisville. She has to get her watch back, hopefully, and she will go into another case. And I think that she will she will eventually probably have some notoriety for solving this kind of case, this sort of eerie, interesting case that is very, very hard to pin down. So I think the next book we'll see her in another small town and hopefully getting into some kind of mischief.
Right.
I,
So your design would be more that this is her place, but she's going to move
Mhm.
out. And part of that is that it's not that credible to have enormous amounts of, excuse me, that's my husband and both dogs actually doing an event. So if you could take the dogs, that would be great. Uh, they've been on my lap the whole time. I feel like my temperature is up like 15 degrees. I mean, there's sort of two ways to do a small town mystery. One is to embrace the town and bring in characters and, write on the locals and the whole bit. And the other is to have somebody within a reasonable geographic area, you know, go forth and solve it. But that means you can't bring a lot of the characters back. Their story
Mhm.
tends to be done when you leave Quartz Creek, although it's not impossible that somebody would follow Annie back.
Yeah, I think it's totally possible that characters from certain books from the first book would show up again later, or characters from another book would show up again later. I love it when characters, I'm a huge fan of Robert Parker's Spencer series, and I love it when characters will show back up after a long time, like, oh, Vinnie Morris is here. Like I get so
Right.
excited. So I would love to do stuff like that, even if it's not a return to Quartz Creek. We might get a special guest appearance from someone.
People are mobile today, much more so. It's not like they have to ride a horse over, the mountains or a wagon to get anywhere. But yeah, I mean, there is no right or wrong way to write anything. It's just interesting that you would have a harder time, Sarah, moving your people off to, New Hampshire on a case, although it's not that far. But in the 1960s, it was farther.
Yeah, well, and I think part of the reason that I wanted to have Alice as a character in the book
Right.
was that she sort of allows me to stay focused on the town, whereas Warren will be going out, and his area for the Vermont State Police is quite large, and so he'll
Right.
be traveling to other towns and getting involved in cases that have a sort of a broader scope. But Alice will always kind of keep us to a certain extent in Bethany. So we know what's happening in Bethany. We get those characters. They'll, someone will go in the general store in every book. And I love when a book feels like a homecoming. And that's sort of my hope with this series, is that I can maintain that sense of readers coming home in each book, but also give Warren some pretty interesting cases
So
that
this is not your first series. What do you see comes to, brings this series to the end, aside from a publisher's perhaps lack of interest in continuing, which is probably mostly what happens, but
right.
but it's also possible that, you feel like you've said whatever you had to say about that particular set of characters.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel that way yet, but as you say, there are these pesky, realities of the marketplace that sometimes, don't allow us to continue series, and it's so hard, I think, because and I know a lot of writers who have been in that position, and it's tough because you become so invested in those characters. You've dreamed up lives for them way beyond the books you've written. And in a way that they're still kind of living those lives in your head. And you hope you get to write them all, but most of us don't. But I think the goal with each book is to give the reader a satisfying story so that if it is the last one, they feel good. They feel like they've gotten a complete story, and the character has gone through a journey of some kind. Maybe it's not the total journey, but it's a
Right.
journey of some kind. And so that's sort of always the goal, that you want to leave room if you get to write more, but if you don't, that the reader feels satisfied. So yeah, I think that's sort of, the
There
way
you
I.
are, Archer, or good advice.
Yeah.
So, I know publishers usually do like a two-book contract, not all the time. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's more. But I always hope that if we see one book, we will see another. So are you under contract to do a second book?
I sure am, yes.
Good.
And the next book, I think it will be officially announced soon, or maybe this is, I don't, but the second book, it takes place in a small Kentucky town. So Annie's not going quite as far afield this time, and it is called Brimstone Hollow. So
That's a wonderful
Great
title. I
name.
really like that. So I will say to you, Sarah, that increasingly I am surrounded by authors who run into that situation that you've mentioned. The opportunities for independent publishing, if you have created a following and fans of a series, are terrific today. So you
Mhm.
don't necessarily have to just wave them goodbye.
Yeah.
And I'll be happy to talk to you about that at some point, because I think there's a lot more freedom now to, you
Yeah.
can't do it. It would be total, for Archer, it would be impossible.
yeah,
Publishing a first book, you, you
Right.
need to, you need to make fans and readers, you need to, but if you've established a fan base and a series, or even not a series, but just readers and all,
Yeah.
it's possible to reach them in other ways today. And as
Mhm.
big publishing is getting more and more corporate, and, their overheads are getting higher and higher. I mean, one thing I certainly notice is that the price of books has been jacked up $1 or $2 right across the board in the last month.
Yep.
And so that's another question, how long are readers going to be willing to spend $22 for a paperback, which is a long way from 16 or 17.
Yep.
Dan Brown's new book, hardcover, is $38. I mean, I'm telling our customers to buy it anywhere else. I mean, it's going to be discounted on street corners, so there's absolutely no reason for them to pay us $38 when they can buy it for dramatically less. But so I think, you have to keep the marketplace, but also these tools in mind.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's all changing so fast, and
it
there,
really is.
it's amazing to see. I've been publishing for 22
I know. I've been there the whole time, kid.
years now. You've been there the whole time, and it's amazing how it's changed in those years. It's
Yeah, it really is. But, in ways it does give you more freedom as an author, and increasingly, what happens with your book is really more about you and your social media than it is about your publisher. And so the more diligent you are, which of course cuts into your writing, the better you can do.
Mhm.
So, those are interesting goals. I'm having an idea that it would be really fun if Warren ran into Joe Gunther's father.
Wouldn't that be fun? I'd have to get
We
Archer's
have to
permission.
ask Archer's permission, but
That would be
nonetheless,
fun
he's
to
sort of
think
nice because
about.
I'm really missing Joe in
Yeah,
that whole
I
thing.
am too. Oh, I miss Joe
Right.
so much.
You probably don't even know we're talking about Archer. I apologize, but
Only from the beginning of of
I
his
know he was
Yeah,
a Minotaur author for many years,
many
and
years.
wrote just a marvelous series. Well, anyway, Patrick, come and join us and see. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, I should stop. Did you have one other question that you might want to ask each other? Archer, anything?
well, actually, my other question was pretty much Barbara's. It was about Sylvie. It was how she came to be, and how she grew from that small part to a big main character. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, well, the other thing I was going to ask is, do you write poetry? Because Sylvie does, it's so intimidating to me. I
Yes.
I love poetry. I am not a poet. Every time I have tried, it has been the most abysmal failure. And so it's always impressive to me when prose writers who are very good can also do poet. It seems like, what are you doing?
So it's funny because like you, I love poetry. I read poetry, but I'm not a poet. I've tried. Um, and I think I cheated a little bit by making Sylvie's sort of early attempts, more simplistic. And I think it was easier for me to kind of recreate this very impressionistic, very short poems that she's writing in the first book. And in the second book, she has a more complicated poem, and I was really challenged in writing that. And if she gets better, I think I may be in trouble. So I'll have to either limit her talent, or maybe not show as much of it on the page. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
So is
Well,
there
P.D.
anything,
James managed to do it with Doug Leash actually for many, many years.
Yes, that's
So
right. She did. Yeah. Yeah.
so is
Mhm.
there anything you'd like to ask Archer before Patrick appears?
So I was really curious about how you thought about kind of the folkloric, supernatural, maybe supernatural, maybe not elements of the book, that what you described as the eeriness, and which I love, and I love that will be a continuing sort of motif in the books. How did you approach that? Was that something that you had an interest in? Did you know a lot of folklore yourself? Was it something you had to research?
it's I think growing up the way I did, my mom was a natural storyteller, and everybody in my family was like that. They were very much, here's a story, here's a story. Have you heard this story?
Mhm.
And I think it's also just part of Appalachian culture. There's a long, strong storytelling tradition,
Yeah.
including murder ballads. I mean,
Yeah.
it goes back to before the people who are in Appalachia now, when their ancestors were in England and Scotland and Ireland. Those ballads, the child ballads, you can find them going way back. So I think there's a really strong storytelling tradition there, and there's still lots of storytelling festivals all over Appalachia. Um, but also, I just love stories, and I especially love stories that sort of poke into reality from
Mm.
another place.
Yeah.
And that goes for everything from like ghost stories that you'd hear as a kid to, like, I was addicted to the X-Files as a kid. Like, I still love it. So, I mean, things like that are definitely a huge draw for me. But it I have a hard time doing anything completely straight. I like to push at the edge of reality a little bit. And I think the way we tell stories is a a good example of how I think all of us are like that to an extent. We want a little magic in the world, and the people of Quartz Creek are certainly no different.
Yeah.
But there's a long tradition of that in Appalachia. The Scots that came over were because that's so I'm sorry, we're the Outlander bookstore, so I know a lot
Yeah,
about
that's right.
about all that. But and I lived there for a long time. So it's the music too. It's not
Mhm.
just the stories, it's the ballads and the music and the festivals, the ceilidhs, all that kind of thing. So I think people kind of expect, I mean,
Mm.
why are they called the Great Smoky Mountains? Was it because of the chestnut trees no longer with us and the drifts of the white blossoms, or is it because of the fog and the clouds that, kind of shrouded it? That just calling them the Smoky Mountains, I think. The Blue Ridge Mountains, it all kind of, evokes that.
Yeah.
So you're in the right part of the country for writing about that kind of thing. So anyway, Patrick, come and tell us if we have any questions or comments from the audience, or you have questions.
Yeah, there's a lot of people tuning in. And let's see here. Catherine would like to know, Sarah, will we see more of Maggie Darcy?
I hope so. I really, really hope so. I have more stories I want to tell about Maggie, and um, my stay tuned is what I'll say.
Let's see. Oh, as a follow-up, how many books do you plan on writing in this series, or do you have a plan?
So, as we said, you kind of have to plan, but be flexible, I think is the name of the game. And I would love if I'm able, I would love to take this series sort of up through the 1970s. So the series starts in 1965, and there's just so much history that's about to happen in this period of American history. And I'd love to be able to sort of, take all of these characters into the 1970s and who knows, maybe beyond, but to kind of track those changes in Vermont and nationally. I don't have a number, but I do in my head have kind of stories I want to tell about all of these characters as they age and as things change in the world.
Let's see. There was a question. I keep losing it here on the screen, but there was a question. It had something to do with writing dialogue, and it was for both of you. And the question was something like, do you have difficulty writing dialogue, or do you have any trouble? How do you know when it's right, or whether you've hit a clunky note, or it was something along those lines. Is dialogue challenging for you, or is it something that comes easily?
Archer, give us an answer.
I think when I write, like I said before, I am living in that scene. So mostly what happens is I know what needs to be accomplished in a scene typically, and I let it play in my head and then I write it down as it happens in my head. Then when I go back through, I just try to listen for anything that sounds flat or that sounds too pat or too much like we've all seen this before. And I just try to find those things. But I mean, mostly, yeah, it's mostly just writing down what's happening in my head. And I think for this, it's a regional book. So there's a lot of regional dialogue, and
Right.
that is always a concern. You want, especially because I'm writing about a place I grew up, I want to do a good job. And the biggest thing for me was when I sent this book to my mom, I was so nervous. And when she got back to me and said that I had done a good job on the way the mountain people talk, I was very relieved and happy.
That's true. It's a long way from California to,
It is.
yeah, to Asheville. Right. Got it.
Um, yeah, I like that sense of looking for moments that feel flat because I think that's right. I think you want dialogue to feel lively and real and to kind of come off the page in a sense. And so certainly that's something. I mean, I found it challenging to make sure that I was writing dialogue sort of the way people would have spoken in 1965 rather than now. And so, the use of slang and colloquialisms was very, very tricky. And I did a lot of research, reading a lot of newspapers and newspaper columns, novels written during the period, watching films that were made right around that period, and just sort of really trying to get a sense of how people actually talked. Because I think on TV, there's this sense of, like Leave It to Beaver, right? That everybody was saying like Zowie and all, these sort of like 1950s and 60s slang words that in fact not a lot of people used regularly. And so I think you have to be really careful about that too, that it's not kind of what people think natural speech sounded like from that time period, but what it actually sounded like.
Let's see. Yeah, like on account of, I keep picturing Jerry Mathers saying little things like that. Yeah, on account of, or say, what's the big idea?
Yeah.
Things like that. But there's also that thing with dialogue where, uh, as a writer, you are trying to get certain information to the reader, sometimes through dialogue. And I can imagine that there's some parts where it's like, wait a minute, would they really vocalize that?
Yes.
That's got to be tricky sometimes.
That's a pet peeve of mine actually as a reader where a character says, as you know, Bob, last year I had a real problem with with this person who lives next door to me. And yeah, so I think you have to be really careful about doing information dumps in in dialogue because it doesn't sound natural.
Actually, Archer, the master of dialogue was Robert Parker. So, you can't write Boston if you're writing about where you are, but you certainly should have learned from Bob, if you've been reading him about how he really just drove books, sometimes almost all conversation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, he wrote almost all in scene, and that dialogue still crackles. It
Mhm.
just it sizzles when you read it. It it's so fantastic. You can hear everything.
He didn't, it's quite spare. He didn't,
Mhm.
Didn't waste a word.
did not put in waste words. And, it was always a joy to read him. I used to, when I would get a new Parker, I mean, we were friends and he was with us a lot. I would always kind of save it to when I really needed a break because I knew I could sit down with it. I could read it really quickly, but I knew it would just be this amazing, break
Yeah.
from everything. You just dove right into
Yes.
Mhm.
to his world. He
Yeah,
was
I will often I will put aside a book of his that I want to read, and I'll wait until I'm done with whatever stressful thing I've been
right,
doing because I
like a
know when
treat.
I start that book, I'm in it. I'm on vacation now.
Yeah, no, it's a definite treat. It's great to be able to go back and read some of them.
Did you get a sense that he was an obsessive rewriter, or that's the way it came out? Yeah,
Oh,
That's the way it came out. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I told you my wonderful Robert Parker story, didn't I? I'll tell it. I mean, Archer will really love it. He he didn't like doing book events. It was hard to kind of get him on. But anyway, um, he was also a big Red Sox fan, and I grew up in Chicago, so I was a Cubs fan. And so we used to bond over at the Arizona Biltmore over drinks and talk about when he was here about baseball. And I remember saying to him one day, "Do you think either one of us will live long enough to see our team win a World Series and then he would have another drink. I was like, no, it's not going to really happen. So when the Red Sox finally made it to the playoffs and this thing is going on, it went to Game 7. So I would watch it and I would think of Bob. And finally in Game 7, when it was clear the Red Sox were about to win, I went down to my office. I was watching it on television. I came down to my office and I opened up my email and I wrote to Bob and I said, you did it. Now, the master of dialogue, Robert B. Parker, this is what he wrote back to me. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, love Bob. That was his entire, this lifetime goal. And that was all I could say. I've always loved that.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing.
It was. No, it really was. He was so funny. Anyway, anything else?
Let's see. Here's a question for you, Archer. Do you play any instruments?
Oh, no. I wish. I would love to someday take piano lessons.
What about you, Sarah? Do you play?
So I actually in elementary school and I actually all into college. I played in my college orchestra. I played double bass. And the story behind how I became a double bass player is kind of funny. I got my height early. I was, like I was basically as tall as I am now when I was like, 11 or 12. And so somebody came through and they said, we need a girl bass player and we need a boy bass player. And they picked out the two tallest kids in the music class and said, you're going to be the bass players. And so that's how I ended up as a bass player. And I played, into college. And then I didn't play for a long time. But my middle kid, one of my sons, picked up the cello and he was taking Suzuki lessons. And with Suzuki, the parents are expected to kind of play alongside the child. And so I started playing cello when he picked up the cello. And I really enjoyed it, but he very quickly became so much better than me that it was all a little bit, I gave it up because I couldn't be as good as him, and I couldn't move as quickly as he could through the music book. But it was fun. Maybe someday I'll pick it up again.
Do you still have a double bass?
I don't. I actually never owned one. And I think that was part of the problem. I always kind of used the schools or, so I didn't have one that I could practice on. And, they're very, very expensive. It's not like buying a flute.
You'd always be in a rockabilly band with one too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Hard to travel with. Right.
If I'd been better, that might have been my path, but I don't think I was quite good enough.
I think that's about it, guys. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, it's always
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure to talk about the views. So here we have The Witch's Orchard, a first mystery. We don't have a lot of our signed copies left, but I really recommend it. I always recommend that you read first novels because, if you don't, you never get that chance again. It's always important. And for Sarah, I would like to say I don't have a copy of Agony Hill to hold up, but I definitely recommend maybe Sarah does. Oh, excellent. Good thinking. All right. So Agony Hill out in paperback, and then Hunter's Heart Rich. They're a wonderful pair together. And what could be better with upcoming Labor Day weekend, for example, to have a little reading binge. So thank you all very much, authors. It was really a pleasure to see you again. And thank you all for